We found ourselves ensnared in yet another argument, one of those repetitive disputes that had started to feel all too familiar. It began over something trivial, as most arguments do. I had suggested we spend the evening together, thinking I was being thoughtful by offering to put aside my work and distractions for us. But instead of gratitude, her response was harsh and dismissive. "I don't owe you intimacy," she said, her voice cold, her arms crossed offensively, and her gaze daring me to challenge her words. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had misheard. I laughed nervously, not sure how to process her words. "What does that even mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like," she snapped back, her tone cutting. "Just because we're married doesn't mean I owe you anything." Her words struck me like a physical blow. We had been married for 8 years. 8 years filled with sacrifices, late nights, and tireless efforts to build a life together. Now, in a single moment, she had dismissed everything that had held our marriage together. Trust, intimacy, partnership. I wanted to say so many things, but nothing came out. I just stood there, staring at her, feeling as though the woman I had shared my life with for nearly a decade had suddenly turned into a stranger. The argument didn't last long. She walked out, leaving me alone with my thoughts, replaying every word of our conversation over and over. At first, I tried to rationalize her behavior, telling myself she was just stressed or having a bad day. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a fleeting outburst. It wasn't the first time she made me feel insignificant. It was just the first time she had articulated it so bluntly. That night, sleep eluded me. Her words, "I don't owe you intimacy," echoed relentlessly in my mind. I began questioning everything. Had I missed the signs? Had I pushed her away? Or had I been deceiving myself, believing we were still a team? By morning, my sadness had transformed into something else, resolve. If she didn't owe me intimacy, then perhaps I didn't truly know her anymore. The sacrifices I had made to keep our marriage together suddenly felt futile. But I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I began to observe over time. I started to notice the growing imbalance between us. Her dismissive tone, her lack of enthusiasm for my efforts to make her happy, and her indifference to our shared life together all became glaringly obvious. I began to reflect on moments that once filled me with pride. The late nights I spent working overtime to ensure we had a home, the times I prioritized her needs above my own, the countless small acts meant to show her love and support. Now, all of that felt empty, as though my sacrifices had been forgotten the moment they no longer suited her convenience. It wasn't just the grand gestures that went unnoticed. It was the smaller things, too. I remembered cooking her favorite dinner after a particularly tough week, only to be met with a lukewarm thanks before she walked away. Or the nights I stayed up listening to her vent about work, sacrificing my own sleep so she wouldn't feel alone. For me, intimacy was never just about the physical. It was about connection, mutual respect, and feeling valued. But somewhere along the way, those things had slipped away. I began to pull back, not out of anger, but as a form of self-preservation. I stopped starting conversations, stopped making the extra effort to ease her life. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she just didn't care. Either way, it only confirmed the painful realization that our marriage had become a one-sided effort. I decided to stop being the one to carry the burden of keeping things together. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, refusing to fill it as I once had. At first, she didn't even seem to recognize the shift. She was so used to me being the one to keep things alive that my withdrawal blended into the background. I'd sit in the living room, scrolling through my phone or flipping through channels, and she barely glanced up. But as the days passed, I could feel a change. She started to notice the difference. Small comments slipped out. "You've been quiet lately," or "Is everything okay?" I shrugged them off, unwilling to give her an opening to twist the situation and make me explain myself. After all, it was her words that had brought us to this point. It became clear that she was starting to feel unsettled. Her responses grew more sharp, almost petty. Critiquing how I folded the laundry or commenting on insignificant details, she started to nitpick the smallest things, complaining about the laundry, accusing me of neglecting to refill the gas tank, or criticizing me for being distracted during conversations we weren't even having. But I refused to take the bait. I let her words wash over me, refusing to get sucked into the same old cycle. I was done playing the game. Then something unexpected happened. She began to make small gestures. At first, they were subtle. A cup of coffee placed beside me while I worked late, a suggestion to watch a movie like we used to. But I didn't rush to grab at these crumbs of attention. I let her actions linger there, unacknowledged. I wasn't trying to punish her. I just needed to see if these efforts were genuine or merely another way to smooth things over without dealing with the deeper issues between us. As the tension between us grew, it became clear she didn't know how to handle this new version of me, the one who no longer went out of his way to make things work. One evening, she asked, her voice softer than usual, "Are you mad at me?" I looked her in the eye and said the truth I had been holding in for so long. "I'm just done trying harder than you." The words landed like a slap. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was losing. I wasn't angry or sad. I was simply done apologizing for wanting more than she was willing to give. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken tension. She was quieter than usual, unsettled, almost as if she were waiting for me to crack and explain myself. I didn't. I went through my day as if nothing had changed, coffee, emails, and off to work without even glancing in her direction. That's when the text messages started. "We need to talk." I ignored them. "Seriously, we can't just act like this isn't happening." I left that one unread. By the time I returned home, she was pacing the living room, visibly rehearsing whatever speech she had prepared. But when she tried to speak, I stopped her. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice flat as I dropped my keys on the counter. "What do I want?" she snapped, disbelief in her voice. "You're the one acting like a stranger in our own house. I want to know what's going on with you." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was almost unbelievable. "What's going on with me? Really? I'm just following your lead. You made it perfectly clear what this marriage is and isn't. The night you told me you didn't owe me intimacy." Her face flushed red. I expected her to deny it, but instead, she went on the defensive. "And I don't. I'm allowed to set boundaries," I told her. "If you can't handle that, maybe that's more your problem than mine." I swallowed my anger, keeping my voice level. "You're right. You don't owe me intimacy. But let me ask you something. Do I owe you commitment? Do I owe you loyalty? Do I owe you anything beyond simple respect?" Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her defensive armor. "I'm just saying," I continued, "if we're playing by those rules, then maybe I don't owe you date nights, emotional support, or even coming home at the end of the day. Maybe I don't owe you putting us first when you've already made it clear we're not a priority." She stammered, "That's not fair. You're twisting this." "I just wanted space. I never said I didn't care about you." "Then show it," I snapped back. "Because right now, all I see is someone who wants the benefits of a marriage without putting in any effort." The room fell into a heavy silence. She sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "I don't know how we got here," she whispered. Honestly, neither did I. But instead of sitting down to comfort her, I turned and walked away. For the first time, I wasn't going to be the one to clean up the mess. That night, I locked myself in the guest room. It wasn't a dramatic statement or a way to get her attention. It was simply a boundary. Over the next few days, the distance between us grew, and I used that time to reflect. I asked myself the tough questions. Could I keep living in a marriage that felt more like an obligation than a partnership? Had we changed so much that we couldn't find our way back? Most of all, I thought about myself, who I had become in this relationship and who I wanted to be moving forward. Slowly, I began to realize what needed to happen next. I realized I didn't like the person I had become. I was exhausted. Exhausted from giving more than I received, from chasing affection that should have been mutual, and from fighting alone for something that felt beyond repair. That's when I made my decision. One evening, after another day of silence, I walked into the living room. She sat there, phone in hand, pretending not to notice me. But I could tell by the way her shoulders were tense that she was waiting for me to say something. I didn't waste time dancing around it. "I can't do this anymore," I said. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "What do you mean, this?" I motioned between us. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I can't keep giving, and giving while you act like just being here is enough." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "I'm not angry anymore," I told her. "I'm not even hurt. I'm just done. I don't know if that means we separate, go to counseling, or something else entirely," I continued. "But I know I can't keep living like this." For the first time in weeks, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "So, you're leaving?" I shrugged. Maybe not. But I think we need time apart to figure that out." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost gave in. I almost wrapped her in my arms and promised we'd figure it out, like always. But then I remembered her words, the ones that had cut through me. "I don't owe you intimacy." That spark of anger, the fire that had been keeping me going, reignited. "This isn't just about you," I said firmly. "You made it clear what you don't owe me. Now, I'm making it clear what I won't keep giving." I grabbed the bag I had packed earlier and headed for the door. She didn't try to stop me. She just sat there, quietly crying as I walked out. As I drove away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. Not because it was over, but because for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a choice. I didn't check my phone for hours, knowing she would text or call eventually. But I wasn't ready to face her words yet. I needed space to think, to breathe, without the weight of her expectations hanging over me. That night, I stayed in a cheap hotel, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had led to this point. I kept asking myself the same questions. Had I made the right decision? Was this the end of my marriage, or just the reset we needed? By morning, I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to go back. The first few days apart were strange. I ate dinner alone, sat in silence without the TV buzzing in the background, and went to bed without hearing her footsteps in the hall. At first it felt freeing, but soon the loneliness crept in, not because I missed her, but because I missed what we used to be. On the third night, she called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Hey," she said, her voice small and hesitant. "Hey," I replied. We didn't speak for a while. I could hear her shaky breathing, and I knew she'd been crying. But I wasn't ready to let my guard down just because she sounded vulnerable. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, and her words hit me harder than I expected. This was the same woman who had always seemed so certain of herself, so unwilling to admit fault. Hearing her say she didn't have the answers threw me off balance. "I don't either," I said, "but I know I can't keep living like we were." "Neither can I," she agreed. For the first time in months, we found common ground. It felt like progress. But reality quickly set in, and the conversation stalled. Over the next few weeks, we talked more, but the distance between us remained. She wanted me to come back home and try counseling before giving up entirely. A part of me wanted that too, but I couldn't forget how we got here. The nights I felt invisible, the words that cut deep, and the resentment that had built up over the years. So I set real boundaries this time. If we were going to try again, it had to be different. I wasn't going to chase her affection or beg for attention. She needed to show me she cared enough to put in the work. For a while, it seemed like she was trying. She went to counseling alone when I wasn't ready to join her. She sent long texts about reflecting on her words and actions. She even stopped blaming me for how distant I had become. But as much as I wanted to believe her, something still felt off. Maybe it was the fact that it took me leaving for her to start trying, Or maybe it was a realization that I didn't trust her not to fall back into old habits. In the end, the decision wasn't dramatic. There was no explosive argument, no tearful goodbye, just a quiet understanding that we had grown too far apart to find our way back. A month later, I filed for separation. She didn't fight it. Walking away hurt. But I knew I had finally chosen myself, something I hadn't done in years. Whether it was the right choice, only time would tell. But for now, I knew this. I don't owe anyone more than they're willing to give in return. Not anymore.